Hello, I'm going to talk to you about the Colchester Inn. That is, Colchester's pubs, their names, and a little of the history behind them. Sorry, but I can only mention a few of them, as there's been so many over the years, and I can't cover them all. They came, and mostly went, but some are still left for us to enjoy. So sit back, listen and watch. This is my take on the subject. Way back in the 14th century, King Richard II decreed that pubs must have signs. He stated that whoever shall brew ale in the town, London he was referring to at that time, with the intention of selling it, must hang out a sign, otherwise he shall forfeit his ale. This is just one of many laws that were introduced to control our inns, taverns and pubs. A pub, of course, being a modern day term that derives from public house. I suppose we could argue that this was the beginning of pub signs as we know them today, so varied as they have become. His concern was with the quality of ale. By hanging out a sign, government inspectors would know where to go to check that standards were being met. Mary of Medici, King Charles I's mother-in-law, arriving in Colchester in 1637. In French, this picture reads at the bottom, L'entrée de la reine dans la ville de Colchester. I'm showing you this as it is Colchester's earliest known pub picture, sort of. Her Royal Highness was no doubt oblivious to the fact that to the right of the street, as we are viewing it, was the Swan Inn. Many years ago, and occasionally even today, anybody know the Magpie? Signs were placed on frames that spanned the road, so as to advertise the premises all the better. Can you see the swan, presumably a carved object at that time, sitting on top of the framework? This is also our earliest known picture of a pub sign. On the opposite side there is another such sign that I have no idea about. It is believed that the artist would have been situated on top of All Saints Church Tower to get this view, which is loosely accurate. No photographs in those days. I will mention the swan again later on, but hey, why a swan? Why name an inn as such? Could the owner's name have been Swan? Or was it perhaps just a whim? Historical. Let's have a look at some of our pub signs, shall we? Thanks to Richard II, pub signs developed from what were probably quite simple signs into our modern day versions, often swinging on an elaborate wrought iron frame that in themselves are probably even older than the signs. The reason being, of course, that our modern day painted signs do not weather well and need to be periodically replaced, quite often with a completely different look, or perhaps when the name of a house is changed for some reason or other. The houses would take on a name and the sign of that house would reflect its name. Centuries ago, most people were illiterate, so a sign had to be easy to recognise. Thus we get the oldest houses with names such as the Bull, the Cock, the Leopard, the Crown, with their signs perhaps being a model of the creature or object rather than a painted sign. Some of those signs still exist, but most are now the product of the pub sign artist, and also include the name of the brewer that owns them, but more of that later. Here we have 3 Colchester pub signs, those of the Boadicea, the Old King Cole and the Ancient Britain, all historic names connected with Colchester. The Boadicea, located at Headgate in the town centre, was renamed as such in 1981 to get away from a dubious past life and retaining that name until it was renamed in 1997 as the Fox and Fiddler. It started life as the Ship before records record, and is probably dating from the 17th century. Its second name was the Elephant and Castle, then the Headgate, then the Boadicea. Of course, Queen Boadicea of the Icenies destroyed Roman Colchester in AD 61 in retaliation for her tribe being badly treated by the Romans. Then we have Old King Cole, which held this name from 1994 to 2004. Previous to that, it was built in 1962 as the King Cole on the site of Dilbridge Hall on Ipswich Road. It also took the names at different times of Squire's Table and Hoofers. The Flying Fox in nearby Harwich Road closed in 2000, and its dodgy customers from White City sought an alternative. It only takes a few ne'er-do-wells to bring down the reputation of a pub and to deter decent folk from going there. The Old King Cole succumbed and became, as did so many others before it, part of our pub heritage. Later demolished, and the site filled with the usual crammed housing units that Colchester planners are so good at encouraging and delivering. King Cole was, of course, the nursery rhyme name for Cunobalin, who united the territories of the British tribes, the Trinovantes and the Catavalorni, to form the most powerful kingdom in Celtic Britain for the 3 decades before the Roman conquest in AD 43. The Roman Suetonius, in his Lives of the Caesars, described Cunobalin as Britannorum Rex, the King of the Britons. Moving on, the ancient Britain was first licensed in 1956, a pub built when the Shrub End housing estate was being built. The choice of name was an obvious one, as the ancient British people lived in that general area before and after the Romans arrived in AD 43. Let's look at a few of the laws that have shaped our pub culture over the centuries. In 1188 we had the first tax on beer to raise money for a punch-up for the Crusades. 1267 came the assize of bread and ale, setting prices for the sale of beer. In 1495 we had an alehouse licensing system being set up, taking sureties from landlords. In 1536 came the dissolution of the monasteries, which led to many new inns, as the monasteries were no longer able to offer accommodation to travellers. Shortly after, 1552, we have a first act of licensing of alehouses, which was mainly concerned with taking sureties from landlords for good behaviour. 1753 came the annual licensing being made statutory. In 1764, 78 licences were granted for a Colchester population of around 10,000 people, or 1 per 128 people. In 1862 this had grown to 97 licences for around 23,000 people, or 1 per 237 people. 1826 gave us the Weights and Measures Act, which was introduced to bring accuracy to pint measures defined for drinking vessels. The pewter mugs that were used at the time were stamped accordingly, and as a result many fines were issued to landlords for breaches, mainly due to the pewter mugs distorting in shape through ill use, of course heralding the glass vessel in later decades. We've looked at historic signs, now let's have a look at pub names associated with trades. The Baker's Arms in Magdalen Street started life as a beer house in the 1830s, rather than as a public house. Beer houses were introduced by the Duke of Wellington's Beer House Act of 1830 as a response to the immense damage that was being done to family life by the drinking of spirits, especially gin. Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for two was the phrase of the time. So it was that the Baker's Arms was one of the first beer houses in Colchester, soon joined by others, only able to sell beer, not spirits, as were full public houses. The reason for the name was that the premises belonged to a baker, so the name was an obvious choice. The arms bit relates to the Guild of Bakers from a long time ago, a time when guilds represented trades. This house had quite a reputation for its bad characters, being renamed the Beer House in the 1990s, and finally it closed its doors in the 2010s. The Forester's Arms in Castle Road also started life as a beer house, but in the 1880s. Although the reason for it being given that name is not known. Perhaps it was to do with the ancient order of foresters, a friendly society that was strong in Colchester around that time. The Bricklayer's Arms in Burgolt Road is another pub name linked to a trade and dates from the 1870s. Again, it uses the word arms in its name and shows a heraldic design on its sign. So why the name? Probably because of the house building that was going on following the arrival of the railway in 1843, work that eventually joined the town to the areas of Braeswick and Mile End. A sign that would have attracted the workers to its door. Likewise, the Maltster's Arms on Hythe Quay, like the Baker's Arms, was a beer house dating from the 1830s, later to become a full public house. Its name was another obvious choice, as the maltings were situated close by on Hythe Quay, and some of the landlords were innkeepers and maltsters. The smell of the malted barley that was the key ingredient for making beer must have been quite something, unlike the smell of the sewerage works today. It was later renamed Quayside. Here are some of our military-themed pubs. Colchester has been a garrison town since Roman times. Our Norman castle, built to house the military, our inns being used in the 17th and 18th century to billet the army, with the government finally agreeing to build military barracks in the 1790s in anticipation of the threat posed by Napoleon. We have it all here in our pub names. The Artilleryman in Artillery Street was opened by Suffolk brewers Green King in 1894. I'm not sure why the road or it was named as such, it being well away from the military area of the town. It would have been built as part of the house building works associated with the nearby Paxman's factory to serve its thirsty workers. The Marquis of Granby was a renaming of a much older pub known as the Crown, which was originally a fine house built around 1500 for a wealthy clothier, when Colchester was one of the biggest cloth-weaving towns in the country. The Marquis of Granby was a soldier, much loved by his men. He was in the habit of helping his retiring soldiers after leaving his service, so much so that some became publicans and naming their houses after their benefactor. This name first appears in the records in 1769, when one Benjamin Brame, perhaps an old soldier, took on the house and changed its name. The Britannia was built as a pub in the 1860s, no doubt to attract the custom of soldiers, located as it was between various of the Victorian military barracks. its name a patriotic one and a good one to attract customers from that area of the town. The British Grenadier dates from the 1850s, its first full licence being granted in 1860 at a time when the camp, as it was known, the first wooden hutment barracks, were built in readiness for the Crimean War. This picture shows it on the far left in the 1880 period. It was situated bang outside the main gates to what was later to be named Hyderabad Barracks, and therefore would have had good trade from the soldiers. Its name is an obvious choice, and its sign an easily recognised one. The bugle horn dates from the time of the Napoleonic War, its first licence being granted in 1800, alongside another pub named as the Duke of York, later to become the Churchill Arms. The former was demolished in the 2010s, but the latter still stands as a testament to that time in our military history. The recreation ground is all that is left of the original barracks that were sold off in the 1820s. The name, again, a good one to attract the patronage of soldiers, and the sign an easy one to recognise. Maritime and nautical named pubs. Examples suggested here are the Lord Nelson, Dolphin, Anchor, Mermaid, Neptune, Whalebone, Norfolk. How about the Seahorse on the High Street? Certainly the ones that were located towards the Hythe, where Colchester's thriving port and docks were located, being so essential for trade to bring goods in and to take goods out. The import of wood from Scandinavia, manure from London to fertilise our farmland, with the reciprocal export of straw and hay to feed the manure-producing horses of the hackney cabs and other such animals. The beer trade, bringing in the beer barrels of London brewers Truman, Hanbury and Buxton, but also sending out our own produced barrels of beer from our own brewers, Daniels, the Colchester Brewing Company, etc. Trade in farm produce, coal, manufactured goods and the like, to mention just a few items that made Colchester such an important port for many centuries, when boats were powered by sails. Many people worked there, and many pubs were there to provide their needs when time and thirsts allowed. The names of the pubs would have been suited to their clientele. Let's talk a little bit about the three signs shown here and a little of their houses. The Lord Nelson was an obvious name for a pub, referring as it does to that great British naval hero Horatio Nelson, whose tactics on the sea brought him many victories, the deciding one being his victory and his death at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1804. This pub seems to have started as a beer shop, an off-licence, not a pub at all. In the 1870s it became a beer house and then a full public house in 1955. Despite it being virtually destroyed in 1971 by a gas explosion, it was rebuilt, but succumbed and closed in the 2010s to be added to the list of much lamented ex-pubs that we have so many of. The Whalebone sign that was hanging in what used to be our Social History Museum, located in Holy Trinity Church in the 1990s, was painted with the inscription Old Whalebone, W. Malcolm. The 1876 map extract shows where it once stood, although the Eagle Brewery across the road is your best way to locate the building. The brewery building still stands with its eagle in a high-up niche. Presumably the tavern had a connection with the whaling industry at some time and was located at the foot of East Hill. It is shown in the alehouse recognizances or the licensing records, from 1770 until 1935. The building still stands. The Norfolk sign gives the impression of it being from naval history, depicting as it does, or did, a battleship. No such thing. The pub is first recorded in 1872 when it was owned by the Norfolk brewers Stewart and Patterson. So it's a fair bet that the owners chose the sign to reflect the place of its brewery. They had a few pubs in the town, selling them all to the Suffolk brewers Green King in 1894. However, we're not here to talk about brewers. That's covered by another of my talks. Was it really the only pub in Colchester from where you could see the town hall clock from its bar window? Another of our maritime pub names. This Edwardian postcard shows the Dolphin with its Daniels, they were brewers and the owners, board over the door around 1910, with St Leonard's Church in the background and the posts that carried the electricity for the trams. It looks idyllic, so different today. The black and white picture is from an earlier in-date painting by Major Bale, depicting a wagon and horse making its weary way up Hythe Hill. The earliest mention that we have of this little tavern is from 1757, when one William Summerson informed gentlemen, farmers and others that he was moving to the Swan at the foot of the hill. It closed in 1939. The building still stands, although it was much altered in the 1940s. So, what was a tavern? What was a pub? What was an inn? I like to think of our old brick-built Victorian pubs as pubs, short for public houses, and referred to as such in public records. Taverns were small places where a drink and a smoke, perhaps a warm from the fire, could be enjoyed in the company of friends. Dating back over many centuries and with a romantic charm, perhaps too a place where a deal or two might be done for a bottle of cognac or more, off a recent arrived boat at the Hythe, out of sight of the exciseman. An inn was a place where a traveller might expect a bed for the night, perhaps shared with a complete stranger, according to how busy the place was, together with a meal and a drink of fine ale, hopefully. We have all seen it on Poldark and other period dramas on our televisions. Often innkeepers brewed their own ale, hence my comment about good ale, or otherwise. Then we have hotels, but let's leave them out of this, shall we? Here are a few more laws that changed our pub culture. In 1830, as previously mentioned, we had the Beer House Act, aimed at altering our drinking behaviour, particularly aimed at gin drinking and alcoholism. Pubs could only open for 18 hours. Only 18 hours? Then, in 1864, came the first of the Contagious Diseases Acts. Why? What relevance could that possibly have? The answer was in fact that the Big Five military camps, which included Colchester, around a third of soldiers were incapable of military duties because of their catching venereal disease, given to them by ladies of negotiable affections, prostitutes by any other name. With so many soldiers in the town, unable to marry and with money in their pockets, our publicans saw an opportunity to make money from carnal pleasures. Many pubs became brothels, with the girls meeting their customers in the bar and going upstairs for some "How's your father?" Again, this is a subject that I deal with in another lecture, so enough, I say. In 1914 came war and the need for the munitions workers to work and to not be in the pub, which was a real problem. So a law came in that gave us the hours of pub openings, which many of us remember to this day. Being sent by mum at closing time to get dad out of the pub. Over many decades, personally owned pubs and taverns especially were gradually being bought out by brewers, and then the licence holders forced to sell the product of the new owners. This became what we knew as tied houses, in that they were tied to the brewers. That way the brewers had a guaranteed outlet for their beer and they could fix the price as well. In 1989, a law known as the Beer Orders Act was introduced that put a stop to this huge monopoly that had developed, to the detriment of the customer and to the landlord. Big companies such as Truman's and Scottish and Newcastle were forced to sell off all but 2,000 of their tens of thousands of pubs right across the country. It resulted in a few free-of-tie houses springing up, places that could choose where to buy their beer and decide their own prices. However, the big boys found a loophole, as they do, and sold most of their pubs to what we know as pubcos, who still constrained the market. Many pubs closed as a result, and the buildings sold off as building plots. We've seen it all before. Many Colchester pubs disappeared as a result of this. A sad story, but hey, that's capitalism for you. Survival of the fittest. In 2003 we had the Licensing Act, which enabled the possibility of 24-hour drinking, aimed at binge drinkers who were causing trouble in public. It also removed the old-style landlords, tenants, licensees, and replaced them with DPSs, designated premises supervisors. Gone was the tried and tested system where a landlord ran a pub as his vocation, often with his family, where he knew his job and his customers and kept good order. The pub was in trouble. Big Brother was out to get it. In 2006 we had the Public Health Tobacco Act, which banned us from smoking in pubs. That too resulted in many pubs closing, allegedly. Thank goodness for government intervention in our lives. Pubs no longer. I've discovered well over 300 pubs in Colchester that have been in existence over 4 or so centuries. Today we have a little over 40 of them left. A few of those whose signs I was able to capture but that we have now lost are here. We've got the Bell at Old Heath, the Clarence, which is still with us but not by the same name, the Sun at Lexton, the Drury Arms on Drury Road, which was closed after Colchester United moved home, and the Rising Sun at the Hive. This list dates from the end of 2014 and shows the effect of changing times in the pub world in Colchester, which I believe is reflected across the country. Cheap beer in supermarkets, Sky Telly, drink driving laws have all had an effect on people's drinking habits. We can see here the loss of 26 pubs closed down in a 20-year time span, 9 of these being demolished for new housing. 16 of them have changed their names. I feel sure that this list is well out of date and that we have lost several more of our pubs in recent years. Big business has moved into the town centre and many drinking halls and mass catering bars have opened up. It's a changing world. But on the upside, our village pubs on the outskirts of town are thriving, catering for a different type of customer seeking pub food and a quieter drinking environment, or perhaps simply for a spot of courting. We would welcome up-to-date information about recent changes. I mentioned the Marquis of Granby earlier in this talk, so let's take a look at what is to be seen inside this ancient building, built by a wealthy clothier around the beginning of the 16th century, and later to become an inn, or was it a tavern? This picture shows the pub sign depicting the bald-headed marquis. Then we have two of the many wood carvings that are to be seen inside, followed by a photograph of when they had a beautiful floral display for Colchester in bloom. Then a bas-relief of the marquis from when the pub was restored after a fire in 1914. Finally, the amazing bas-relief over the equally amazing fireplace, which shows people from our amazing past. People like Old King Cole, Queen Boadicea, the Emperor Claudius, St. Helena, Athelstan, the Emperor Constantine, Udo Dapifer, Caratacus, my personal hero, etc., all sitting down to a meal at the celebrated Colchester Oyster Feast. Here we have one of the fine wood carvings over the fireplace, showing a Florentine lady of the time, and with others along the same theme, reflecting the international range of the owner's trading activities. There are many other fascinating carvings like this, so I recommend you go and have a look if that's possible. In the centre of one of the rooms, on a ceiling beam, the owner of the house, Henry Webb, has his initials carved amongst the images of monkeys and wild beasts and creeper-type vegetation. These have to be the finest carvings of this type in Colchester. There have been some mysterious names for our pubs over the years. How did those names come about? What were the owners thinking? Here we have 4 signs that might need some explanation. The odd one out. When John Parrick took on the pub in the 1980s, it had the name of the Mermaid. He was keen to be different, the odd one out. He had his eye on what was to become known as real ale, not the gassy stuff, pressure fed through pumps. No Watney's Red Barrel or Double Diamond for him. No, John wanted the real stuff, cask conditioned ales, quality beer. He was unconstrained by a tie to a brewer, and so he set about his new venture with dedication, and soon rose to being the best real ale pub in town, and with a strong following from the guys and gals from Camera, bless 'em all. Chilled lager, my preference, was not on display, and mobile phones, another scourge of modern living according to John, were not to be used in his pub, the odd one out. The Mad Hatter stars on its sign, how fitting. The Silver Oyster. This pub took this name from the gauges that were used by officialdom to check the size of Ostia edulis, the Colchester native oyster, something that Colchester is renowned for. The sign maker used a picture of a scallop shell, but it has the same effect, I guess. The pub used to have a cabinet telling all about these gauges, with silver versions displayed within. The cabinet disappeared one day, never to be seen again. I would have loved to have gotten a picture of it, but I never got the chance. The Donkey and Buskins in Layer de la Haye, an oft discussed pub sign with no definite provenance. The land around the pub is scrubby, so it's quite possible that the one-time landlord dressed his donkey with protective legwear, known as buskins, as can be seen in the sign's picture. A bit of fun, whatever the explanation, and quite unique in the country, I think. The Goat and Boot. Many a bar-stool philosopher has pontificated about this pub sign. There's a story there somewhere that has been lost with time. The upstairs of this pub was once a malting floor where barley was spread until it turned sufficiently for use by the ale brewer. On the land behind once stood the brewery of Nickel and Co., water of sufficient quality being present for the brewing process. This picture shows an advertisement of 100 or so years ago, but as to the name, who knows? To recap, the odd one out is on Mersey Road, facing the 12th century wall of St John's Abbey. It's not a Roman wall, sorry. The Silver Oyster is on Queen Elizabeth Way at Monkwick, which, like the ancient Britain on the Shrub End estate, was built when the Monkwick estate was created in the 1950s. The Donkey and Buskin is on the main road through Lair de la Haye, on the outskirts of Colchester, and the Goat and Boot is at the foot of East Hill. So moving on, the hole in the wall is another sign that perhaps needs some explanation. Located at Balkan Gate, or should I say sitting on top of Balkan Gate, one of Roman Colchester's 5 principal gateways. It has been a pub for at least 3 centuries, having various names such as the Green Morris, Woodcocks, and more recently the King's Head. It took its present name as an unofficial nickname after 1843, when the railway first opened a line from London to Colchester. A local amateur historian and postman, William Wire, writing in his diary, noted that, "When I was walking up Balkan Hill, I saw that a portion on the north side of the Balkan fort had been destroyed in order to build additional rooms to the King's Head Inn to command a view of the railway. What a pity that one of the best preserved remains of Roman times should be destroyed to administer to the sensual pleasures, as it may be considered only as a decoy to induce persons to enter the house to drink." Indeed, the landlord of the time had bashed a big hole in the wall to enable his customers to see the new railway spectacle from the bar, thus bringing about the name. It was not until 1962 that the name was officially changed to the Hole in the Wall. These pictures show how it looked in 1965, the road being much higher than it is today and narrower. A few years later, the area was redeveloped as part of the Southway traffic scheme, with the road level lowered by some 4 metres to better enable traffic to climb the very steep Balkan Hill. The Balkan Gate had been stopped up, or balked, which is where the name comes from, in antiquity, probably because it was a big problem to horse-drawn traffic, thus, thankfully, leading to the gate's survival. Bad place to put a gate, Mr. Roman engineer. This second picture is from a later date and gives a better view of the added window and of the pub's present-day sign. Indeed, the names of our pubs are many and varied, ranging from the obvious to the obscure. What inspired the name, the Flea and Flannel? We've looked at a few of the names along the way in this talk. Here are a few more. Themes such as brewing, the famous, heraldry, historic, locations, military and naval, mythical, nautical and maritime, couplets, sporty, religious and superstitious, patriotic, traditional, odd, trades and professions. Colchester has them all in its pub names. Here are a few more of our pub signs. The Purple Dog, a new name for the Clarence on Eld Lane. The George, one of the finest inns in town on the High Street. The Bull, the oldest recorded inn in Colchester, mentioned in records in the 15th century, located in Crouch Street, and still with its original name. The Leather Bottle on Shrub End Road, the Globe on North Station Road, and finally the sign of the 3 Cups, pictured here, taken from this once great inn in the High Street, that was demolished in the 1960s and a new house by the same name opened in Trinity Street, where this sign is to be found today. As I said, the Bull is the oldest recorded pub in Colchester. It was a coaching inn for many decades in the olden days. However, in recent times, the archway that used to be for coach and horse access to the stables at the back, as can be seen in the photograph and indicated on the 1876 map here, has been blocked off, and the covered way that was is now part of the main bar. In the 2010s it was renowned for its live music events. Note also on the map the Essex Arms that was knocked down to make way for the Southway works in the 1970s. Yet another of our pubs lost, never to be seen again. A travesty. The Cups was destroyed in untypical haste before a preservation order could be brought in by the Borough Council, who wanted it gone. Such a history it had. Please indulge me when I quote the late Gerald Rickwood. One of its most famous guests was the Irish peer, the Earl of Masserine, who came to the inn with his beautiful countess some time after their release from imprisonment on the eve of the fall of the Bastille in 1789. The halcyon days of the Cups, an inn where travellers bait, then post away, were during the long years of the Great French War. It then justified its claim, made in 1819, to be one of the first inns in England to say more in an advertisement than it is the Three Cups at Colchester is scarcely necessary, for in all Europe this house is well known and recognised. Here, in September 1794, the Earl of Onslow gave a sumptuous entertainment to his brother officers of the Surrey Fencible Dragoons. 5 years later, Admiral Duncan stayed at the inn, and in August 1800, the Turkish ambassador and suite in 5 carriages changed horses. In June 1801 came Count Bernstorff, the Danish ambassador. The Earl of Clanwilliam and later Lord Nelson stopped at 2 p.m. for refreshment, followed in June by the Prince du Conde, and in June 1802 by the Princess of Monaco. The most illustrious company ever assembled at the inn was in November 1807, when the exiled Louis XVIII of France, the Comte d'Artois, the Duc de Berry, and other noblemen gathered in the elegant, large new room. In November 1810 came the Count de Gottrop, the exiled King of Sweden. In the new room, where Incledon, the famous tenor, sang, the Countess of Chatham and the Earl of Dartmouth were present at a grand ball in September 1812. In August 1813, the Prince Regent with the Marquis of Hertford stopped on their way into Suffolk, as they did on other occasions. In November 1816 came Prince Esterhazy, and in December 1823 the Royal Duke of York, the Duke of Wellington, Viscount Granville, and others to change horses. George Green, the balloonist, was here in December 1827, and in May 1833 the Duke and Duchess of St Albans, the latter an actress, and widow of James Coutts, the banker. Daniel O'Connell, the Liberator, took breakfast in June 1836. Here stayed in Victorian days Major General Gascoigne, Commandant of the New Camp in 1856, as did the Earl of Cardigan of Balaclava fame in 1866. Next year Matthew Arnold, the poet, who declared it to be one of the best inns in England. In 1887 came, among others, General Miller, the Bishop of Colchester, Corney Grain, the entertainer, the Marquis of Ripon and Lord Monkwell, Earl Roberts, V.C. Bobbs was here, in July 1903, and in the following year Prince Alexander of Teck, Generals French, Bruce Hamilton and Baden-Powell, with a dozen foreign attachés who were guests of the king. The popular actress Ellen Terry, with her husband James Carew, stayed one night in August 1908, and so the roll runs. So there, and so it went on until 1965, when it was destroyed. We have lost so much of our heritage. Don't even start me on St Nicholas Church. The Lion, the White Hart and the Angel, all on the High Street, were named in 1603 as the only 3 wine taverns in the town, being ancient inns and taverns. The Angel exists today as Angel House on the opposite corner to the town hall, and the White Hart once stood where Barclays Bank was later to be built. The sign of the Red Lion is depicted on many heraldic shields, perhaps the most famous being that of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, who died in 1399. This ancient timber-framed house was once the home of the Howard family, with Sir John Howard being appointed Constable of Colchester Castle in 1461, and later created Duke of Norfolk. In the goodness of time, the marital difficulties of, you guessed it, Henry VIII, and the dissolution of the monasteries led to this house becoming an inn for weary travellers. It was known as the Lion, but was recorded as the Red Lion by 1625. Much has been written about it: ghosts, electioneering, coaching, etc. It has 14th century features, but is mostly of the 15th century, and with many carved wood features, in particular around the archway that faces onto the High Street, where George and the Dragon are depicted, a sign that Sir John Howard held the Order of the Garter. Upstairs in the bar and function rooms are many exposed beams and carved features. A visit is to be recommended, of course. The 1876 map shows the layout of the building with its open internal courtyard that led to the stables. Here it was that customers were brought from London or perhaps Harwich by the staging coaches, the heavy timber gates being open in readiness, the coach driver taking off his hat at the last few seconds, ducking under the lintel for fear of losing his head, and driving straight into the yard without stopping, whereupon the landlord's men would close the gates and the landlord would welcome his captured guests. He couldn't have them alighting in the street and possibly choosing another of Colchester's fine hostelries, could he? Lion Walk, which used to be a part of Culver Street, looks very different today. This plan is taken from a deed from the 1880s and shows how the stables were laid out and the tap bar at the rear, where one could get a drink in simple surroundings without disturbing the running of the main business of innkeeping. Most of the inns had tap bars, the Cups, the Fleece in Culver Street, and others. I guess that the word tap referred to the beer tap. The George was another of our coaching inns, which also dates back to the 15th century. Quoting the late George Rickwood again, "Here has the shrewd merchant sealed his bargains. The dashing cavalier roistered right merrily. The sober-visaged Puritan discussed theology and strong waters. The reckless gentleman of the road scented his quarry. The red-coated soldier of Marlborough, Cumberland and Wellington sought billets. And the pigtailed sailor of Vernon, Rodney and Nelson spent his hard-earned prize money heedlessly on his way up to the Great East Road, from Yarmouth or Harwich to the giddy whirl of London life." This picture shows the coach entrance archway in George Street, much less accessible than that of the Red Lion across the road, and, like the Bull's Archway that we saw earlier, has been filled in and the covered way incorporated into the main building. No need for it anymore. No more coaches. Note the 1876 map, which shows the triangular space opposite the archway to enable the coach driver to swing around and into the stable yard. That space is still there outside the snooker club. Note too the Swan Inn. Do you remember at the beginning of the talk Mary of Medici and the sign of the Swan? Well, here was where the inn was situated, and which closed around 1934. There are many stories to tell of this wonderful inn, now a hotel of note, of course. But let's leave that for another day, shall we? The Stockwell is another ancient house, said to date from the 15th century. It seems to have become a beer house in the 1860s, so it was not an ancient tavern, just an ancient house. Reputedly once the home of Daniel Defoe, of Robinson Crusoe and Moll Flanders fame. Defoe once penned this short poem: "Whenever God erects a house of prayer, the devil's sure to build a chapel there, and 'twill be found upon examination, the latter has the larger congregation." It became a full public house in 1958, passing from Daniel's to Truman's. The earliest reference found to it is as a public house in a newspaper article of 1866, which mentioned bell ringers' supper. On Monday evening, the bell ringers of Colchester sat down to a good supper at Mr. Frederick Hyam's, Stockwell Arms, Stockwell Street, in commemoration of their recent achievement in having rung 1,000 changes on St. Peter's Church bells. With the fabric in poor shape, neglected by its owners, it was sold and the new owners heavily restored it in the 2010s. But with a sad end when its saviour, Mr. Robert Morgan, died unexpectedly, and his wife Maggie just a few years later. Its future thus became uncertain. Here's a selection of bottles that have survived, perhaps a century since they were used by various Colchester brewers, embossed with names Daniel and Sons, Nickel and Co., the Colchester Brewing Company, R. Crook, H.W. Stevens, screw tops and those that use a marble. No cans of beers in those days. Some labels have also survived, these from Daniel's at West Burgolt, which was taken over by Truman's in the 1950s. Also from Cook Brothers, who had premises in Mersey Road, Colchester. Then we have some drinking vessels, proofed and stamped pewter mugs from the 1820s up until the beginning of the 20th century, before glass mugs took over. Also a pair of leather jacks with their tar lining for fluid retention, and an earthenware mug typical of times before the Weights and Measures Acts took hold. Let's have a look at a few more of our pub signs, this time on a patriotic theme. The Victoria in North Station Road, many times the winner of the coveted CAMRA Pub of the Year award, and specialising in real ales. A house free of tie, and doesn't it show? A real favourite of mine. It started life in the 1850s as a coffee house, later becoming a pub. Then we have the Queen's on Beerchurch Road, a typically patriotic heraldic crest on its sign and dating from 1894, located and named to attract the custom of soldiers from the nearby army barracks. Lastly, the Salisbury Hotel in Salisbury Road, adjacent to Lecato, artillery, infantry and cavalry barracks. So why the name? Well, the pub's sign depicts Robert Arthur Talbot Gascoigne Cecil, the 3rd Marquis of Salisbury, 1830 to 1903. Lord Salisbury was an English Conservative statesman who became Prime Minister in 1885, coincidentally the same year as the pub's licence was granted. He was Prime Minister during the Crimean War, which would have made him an especially important personality to the military personnel from the nearby army barracks. Sounds patriotic enough for me. Sadly, the land on which this building stood was worth a lot more than the pub's business, and 17 dwellings were built on the spot. Another lovely old pub lost to us. Here are some more signs that won't be seen again, with one exception, as I speak. The Royal Mortar on Military Road is yet another of our military-themed pub names, named as such as it stood near Mortar Field, where this special type of artillery piece would have been used for practice. Deafening. The Prince of Wales, known as the Feathers, on Magdalen Street, where small boys would wait outside at closing time to pick up money dropped out of the pockets by fighting soldiers as they tumbled out of the doors. A sign of what is assumed belonged to the King's Head in Head Street, hanging at one time in our Social History Museum. That inn was where the Royalist generals surrendered to General Fairfax during the siege of Colchester in 1648, and who were taken out and executed or murdered according to your politics. Also decades later, where bare-knuckle fighting bouts were held in the courtyard. The Robin Hood on Stanwell Street, known as a bit of a roughhouse, and where the landlord blasted and killed one of his customers with a shotgun that he kept handy behind the bar. The Traveller's Friend on Mill Road, closed and demolished for housing in 1995. The Waterside Inn on King Edward Dock at the Hive, previously the New Dock Inn, so much favoured by sailors moored at the dock, closed in 1988. And then lastly, the Six Bells on Grinstead Road, closed in 1991 and demolished to make way for a new Tesco superstore. St Botolph's to the Hive. As I draw this talk to a close, let's have a look at what started me off on my quest for information about our Colchester inns, taverns and pubs. Chatting one day with Reg Carter in Magdalen Street in the 1990s, he happened to mention a list of pubs that an old gentleman had once compiled from memory, and a copy of which Reg had put on his office wall. It set me off on a voyage of discovery. So here it is, a list of 25 pubs in a straight line that existed all at one time, probably around 1900, from Plough Corner, that's St Botolph's Roundabout to you younger folk, to the foot of Hive Hill. It was said that you couldn't have drunk half a pint of beer in each without falling over at the end. Not one of them is in business today, either closed and in new use, or demolished for the land to build housing. The extra six shown there along the river include the Anchor, that became the Spinnaker, and the Maltsters, which became Quayside. Then we have a list of all the pub and bar names that I have found in my research as having existed in Colchester over the centuries. All 352 of them. I have not included some of the more recent creations, and I dare say I missed several others along the way. Some names have been used over and over at different times and at different locations, such as the White Hart 6 times, the Crown 5, the Ship 5, the Swan 5, the Falcon 3, the Rose and Crown 3, and so on. We can't finish without mentioning our landlords. This is the smiling Mr. John Kemp, who took on the licence of the Abbey Arms at St John's Green in 1979. When this picture was taken, he had been the landlord for 28 years, always smiling. At least he was whenever I saw him. One of the best pub landlords in the town at the time. The name of the pub is no mystery, as it is within sight of the 12th century St John's Abbey gateway, all that is left of the Benedictine Abbey that once stood nearby. Henry VIII and all that saw to its destruction. I put this picture up as it records one of many happy days in that pub. The background optics and assorted ephemera, a product of long service that John gave to this pub. Other long-served notables were Mr. Brian Jerome of the Stockwell Arms in West Stockwell Street, Mr. Cliff Razor at the Little Crown in Shortwire Street, Mr. Alan Evans at the Beehive on Bromley Road, Mr. John Parrick of the Oddie, and so many others that were and still are held in our fond memories of days when pubs were pubs, and some still are. So thank you, landlords and landladies, for all that you have done for us over the years. I have shared with you a little of the Colchester pub heritage, its inns, taverns and pubs. I wrote a book on the subject back in 1995, which ran to several later and updated versions. For those that are interested in our old pubs, that book is the place to go for a greater understanding of the Colchester Inn. Hopefully it will still be available by the time you hear this, whether in a bookshop or found on the web. It covers what we used to know as pubs, and does not discuss the wine bars of the 1980s and 90s, etc., which blended into theme bars and later drinking halls that catered for large numbers of people, the likes of the Playhouse, Yates, the Duchess, etc. in the 2010s. Not to my liking at all, but each to their own. I owe my pub appreciation to my old and long departed dad. Thanks, Dad. And so we finish with a quote from Hilaire Belloc, French-born poet, historian, and essayist of the last century. When you have lost the last of your inns, go drown your empty selves, for you will have lost the last of England. This amateur video recording is the second of a series of recordings that I've made, and which are based on the lectures that I used to give in the Colchester area to various groups that had expressed an interest in learning more about Colchester's history. This one is a little bit more light-hearted than the first one, which was Iron Age and Roman Colchester. It's inspired by the research that I undertook back in the 1990s and continued with for many years after. As with the first video, it's a huge story to tell, but of which only a bit can be told here. My retirement to France in 2017 meant that I'm unable to give these lectures in person anymore, so this is my way of making this information available to you for educational purposes and to hopefully help you to appreciate our inns, taverns and pubs of old, and those of the present day, of course. At the very least, I hope that you found this talk of interest. The other recordings that are available in this series are listed on the Camulos website. For further information, please contact me or those that follow me through www.camulos.com. Farewell.